There were 14 rooms in that house and he lived in 3 of them. I found that out my second week. The kitchen, the study, and a first-floor bedroom he'd moved into when the stairs got hard. The other 11 had the shades drawn and the vents closed to save on heating, and when I walked through them, the air had that stillness rooms get when nobody's breathed in them for a while. His name was Halloran, Edward Halloran, 81 years old, and I was the woman who came 4 days a week to check his blood pressure and make sure he ate. I was 34, 6 years out of a marriage, working private duty nursing because it paid better than the floor, and I had a daughter in braces. I thought I was going there to take care of him. 14 months later, I stood in his kitchen at 7 in the morning, and he told me the one thing he'd have done differently. And it wasn't any of the things I'd assumed. Not one. Let me tell you how I got there, because it matters to the rest of it. My name is Denise Whitaker. I grew up outside Youngstown, Ohio, in a house where my mother worked 2 jobs, and my father was around in the technical sense. I got my LPN at 22, my RN at 28, and I have spent almost my entire adult life in rooms where people are having the worst day of their lives, while I take their vitals and keep my voice even. I got divorced at 28. Marcus and I were married 6 years, and it didn't end because of anything you could put in a sentence. It ended because we were both 22 when we started and 40% formed, and by 28, we'd finished forming into 2 people who had nothing in particular to say to each other. My daughter Aubrey was 4 when he moved out. Private duty is a strange corner of nursing. You're not in a hospital, you're in somebody's house, and there's no chart room to retreat to and nobody to hand off to at 7. You are alone with one person, in their space, for 8 hours at a stretch, 4 days a week, sometimes for years. The agency called me in the spring of 2018 about a client in Bradenall, which, if you don't know, Cleveland is where the money lives. Old money. The kind of houses that were built when Cleveland was one of the richest cities in the country. Big lots, lake access, iron gates. They told me the case had turned over 3 nurses in 8 months. That's a flag. Usually it means the family is difficult, or the client is. He's not difficult, the coordinator said. He doesn't talk. The house was gray stone, 1924. And it was genuinely beautiful, in a way that made my stomach tighten a little, because I have never in my life been comfortable in beautiful rooms. Circular drive, slate roof, a carriage house in back that was bigger than the duplex I was renting in Euclid. He answered the door himself, which surprised me. Tall, had been taller, in a cardigan, and pressed slacks at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday with nowhere to be. Full head of white hair, combed. He looked at me the way you look at a delivery you didn't order. He said, "You're the nurse." I said, "I'm Denise." He said, "The kitchen's this way," and turned around and walked, and that was our entire introduction. Here's what I learned in the first month. Edward Halloran had built a commercial real estate company out of nothing starting in 1963. Industrial parks, warehouses, distribution centers, all through Northeast Ohio and into Pennsylvania. He sold it in 2004 for a number I never learned exactly and don't need to. He'd been widowed since 2011. Wife's name was Corinne. There was one photograph of her in the entire house, in the study. And it was not a wedding photo. It was a woman in her 60s on a boat, squinting, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He had 2 children. I learned that from the intake paperwork, not from him. A son, Peter, in Chicago. A daughter, Catherine, in Vancouver. In 14 months, Peter came twice, and Catherine came once. And I want to be careful how I say this next part, because I spent my first months there getting it completely wrong. I assumed he was a cold man who'd driven his children away, and that this was a story about a rich man who deserved his empty house. That was lazy. I've since learned that's almost always lazy, but it took me a long time to find out what was actually true, because the man did not talk. Not out of rudeness. He would answer any question I asked. He just never once, in the first 4 months, said anything he wasn't asked. Then in September, he fell in the kitchen, and everything changed. It wasn't a bad fall. That's the thing about 81. There are no bad falls and good falls. There are falls you recover from, and falls that start the last chapter, and you don't know which one you've had for about 6 weeks. He caught the edge of the island going for a glass, landed on his hip, didn't break it. I was there, which is the only reason it stayed a small event. I got him up, got him to the study, and he was gray and shaking in the way people get when the adrenaline dumps. And he said, first thing he ever volunteered to me, "Don't call my son." I said I had to report the fall to the agency. He said, "Report it, don't call Peter." I asked him why, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Because he'll come, and he'll be very efficient, and he'll leave, and I'll feel worse than I do now." That was the first real sentence Edward Halloran ever said to me. Something shifted after the fall. Not dramatically. He didn't become chatty, but the silence changed texture. He started leaving the study door open when I was in the house. He started asking me things. The first question he ever asked me about myself was in October. "How old is your daughter?" "Aubrey was 10, I told him. He said, "Are you home for dinner?" I said, "Most nights." He nodded and went back to his book, and I stood there holding a blood pressure cuff, feeling like I'd just passed some kind of exam I hadn't studied for. Here's what our days looked like, because I think people imagine private duty is more medical than it is. Blood pressure, weight, medication reconciliation, watching for edema. Maybe 40 minutes of actual nursing in an 8-hour shift. The rest is company. That's the job nobody puts on the invoice. So we developed a routine. I'd make him eggs. He read the Journal and the Plain Dealer, in that order, at the kitchen table. Around 11, we'd do the walk, down the hall to the front room and back, 4 times, which was his cardiac rehab and which he hated. Afternoons, he'd read in the study, and I'd do the paperwork and the pharmacy calls. And somewhere in that fall, we started talking. Slowly. Not confessions. He'd ask about the hospital system I used to work in, and then tell me who owned the building it was in. He'd ask about Euclid, and then tell me about a warehouse deal he did on East 222nd in 1971. He never bragged. I want to be clear about that, because I expected him to, and he never did. He talked about that work the way a mechanic talks about engines. It was just what he knew. I'd tell him about Aubrey's school, about the duplex, about my mother, and he'd listen in a way I've since realized is rare. He didn't wait for his turn. He asked follow-up questions and remembered the answers a week later. That was the strange thing about Edward Halloran. He was not a man who didn't care about people. He was a man who had somehow gotten to 81 without anyone teaching him that caring is something you're supposed to say out loud. Then one afternoon in November, I asked him a question that I have thought about many times since, mostly because I asked it casually, the way you fill a silence. I said, "What was Corinne like?" He put the book down. He looked at the window for probably 15 seconds, and he said, "I don't know how to answer that, and I've had 8 years to think about it." I let that sit. That's most of what the job is, knowing when not to fill a space. After a while, he said, "I know what she liked. I know she took her coffee with too much cream, and she read 3 books at a time, and she couldn't stand my brother." 46 years of facts. He turned the book over in his hands. But if you asked me what she was afraid of, what she thought about when she couldn't sleep, whether she was happy, in the actual sense of the word, he shook his head. "I have no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And there's nobody left to ask." I said, "You were married 46 years. He said, "Yes. And I was on the road 200 nights a year for about 20 of them. And when I was home, I was in that study until 11 o'clock. And she never once complained about it. And I took that to mean it was fine." He looked at me. First time he'd really looked at me in 4 months. Do you know what I've figured out at 81? Not complaining and being fine are 2 completely different things, and only one of them is visible from where I was sitting. I have thought about that sentence approximately 1,000 times. That November, he started talking. Not constantly. Edward Halloran was never going to be a talker. But he'd tell me one thing a day, sometimes two, in the middle of doing something else. Like he could only get it out sideways. I learned about Corinne. She'd been an art history major at Oberlin who never worked after they married, because that's what you did in 1965. She wanted to open a small gallery in Chagrin Falls in about 1979, and he told her the numbers didn't work. They didn't work, he told me. I want to be clear. I ran them. It was a bad deal. Then he said, it never occurred to me that she wasn't asking me to run the numbers. I learned about Peter. 52 by then, a partner at a consulting firm in Chicago, 2 kids Edward saw maybe every 18 months. Edward had put him to work in the company at 19, summers, and Peter had hated every minute of it and had gone to business school anyway, because that was the language they had. He's very good at what he does, Edward said. He calls once a month, second Sunday, and we talk for 11 minutes. I asked if he'd ever told Peter he wanted more than 11 minutes. Edward looked at me like I'd suggested he learn Mandarin. And I learned about Catherine, though that took until January, and it took her actually showing up. She came the week after New Year's. Flew in from Vancouver for 3 days. I met her on a Wednesday morning. She was 48, sharp-featured, exhausted-looking, in a way that has nothing to do with the flight. And she was kind to me immediately, in that specific way that adult children are kind to their parents' caregiver when they feel guilty about not being there. We had coffee in the kitchen while Edward was still asleep, and she asked how he really was, and I told her, and then she said something I didn't expect. She said, "He's talking to you, isn't he?" I said he'd started to, some. And Catherine Halloran laughed, one short, hard laugh with nothing funny in it, and said, "That's incredible. I've been trying since 1994. I want to slow down here, because what Catherine told me over those 3 days changed how I understood everything I'd been walking into 4 days a week. She wasn't bitter. That's what got me. I've met a lot of angry adult children in this work. People who use a parent's decline as a stage for grievances 30 years old. Catherine wasn't that. She was something sadder and more common, which is tired. She'd been the one who tried. For decades. She was the daughter who called weekly, who flew in for things, who sent the grandchildren's school pictures and got a card back that said, "Thank you, Dad." She told me about her wedding in 1998. Vancouver, small, and Edward came and gave a toast that was, her words, 4 sentences about how proud he was, which he read off a card, and then he sat down. She said, "I got the card afterward. I still have it. I've read it 100 times looking for something else in it." I said, "Did you ever tell him you needed more?" And she said the thing that reframed the whole family for me. "Denise, my mother told us not to." She said Corinne had managed the entire emotional life of that family like a switchboard. She'd explain Edward to the children. "Your father's under a lot of pressure. Your father shows it differently. Don't push him." She'd explain the children to Edward, editing, softening. For 46 years, Corinne had stood between a man who didn't know how to say things and 2 children who needed to hear them, and she'd translated. And then, in 2011, she died in 11 weeks of ovarian cancer, and the switchboard went dark. None of us knew how to talk to each other, Catherine said. We'd never done it directly, not once. My mother did all of it, and we didn't even know she was doing it until she was gone. I asked her the obvious question. I asked why she didn't just start now. She was quiet a minute, then she said, "I did. For about 2 years after Mom died." I called more. I asked him real questions, and he'd answer them like a survey. And at some point, you're 45 years old and you're begging, and there's a limit to how long a person can do that before it starts to cost you something you need for your own kids. That sentence has stayed with me as much as anything Edward ever said. Because here's what I want anybody watching to hear. This was not a story about a cruel man. and the family who abandoned him. Every single person in it was doing the best they could with the equipment they had. Edward loved his children in a way he could not operate. Catherine tried, until trying was hurting her. Peter protected himself by keeping it to 11 minutes a month. Nobody was the villain. That's what made it a tragedy instead of a fight. Catherine flew home on a Friday. I watched Edward stand at the front window and watch the car go down the drive, and he stood there a good while after it was out of sight. I said something stupid. I said, "That was nice, having her here." And he said, without turning around, "I didn't ask her one question about her life. 3 days." Then he said, "I don't know how to start. I've never known how to start. And now it looks like something else. It looks like I don't care. And I don't know how to correct the record after 40 years of it." That spring, I started noticing what the house actually was. 14 rooms. 3 in use. I'd known that since week 2, but in the spring of 2019, I started really looking at the other 11. The dining room seated 12, and the table had a sheet over it. The living room, the formal one, at the front, had furniture from probably 1988 and a fireplace that hadn't been used in a decade. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms with the beds made and the shades down, and one of them had been Catherine's and still had a corkboard on the wall with 3 pushpins in it and nothing else. There was a sunroom on the east side, all glass, that Corinne had used. Her books were still on the shelf. Edward never went in there. Not once in 14 months. I asked him about it in April. He said, "I keep the heat off in there." That was the whole answer. And it wasn't a lie. The heat was off. It just wasn't the reason. Here's what I want to say about that house, and it's the part that has changed how I look at my own life. And I don't say that lightly, because I distrust people who claim a job changed them. That house was a monument to a plan. Everything in it had been built for a future that had a specific shape. The grandchildren visiting in summer, the dining room full at Thanksgiving, Corinne in the sunroom, Edward finally slowing down at 70 and getting to the part where he enjoyed it all. He'd bought a house for that life in 1979. He'd worked 200 nights a year to pay for it. And the life never arrived, not because of a catastrophe, because the thing he'd been deferring turned out to require a skill he'd never practiced. And you cannot pick up 40 years of relationship the day you decide you're ready. He had built the container perfectly. He just never learned to make what goes in it. I started thinking about my own apartment in Euclid at that point. 900 square feet. And I started thinking about the fact that Aubrey was 11 and had about 7 years left in my house, and that I was working 4 12-hour days a week, plus agency overtime, and that I had told myself a story about how this was temporary and for her. I want to be honest. I did not have a revelation and change my life. That's not what happened. I picked up an extra shift that same month. But something had started, and it was uncomfortable, and it didn't go away. In May, Edward asked me a question that I still don't have a good answer to. We were doing the walk, 4 laps, front room and back. He was slower that spring. He said, out of nowhere, "How old are you?" 35. He said, "Are you doing what you're going to keep doing?" I said I wasn't sure what he meant. He said, "I mean, is this it? Is this the shape of it? Because it's much later than you think. And I know that sounds like something an old man says, but I'm telling you as a matter of arithmetic. I was 35 in 1973. It was Tuesday. He kept walking. Lap 4. Then he said, "The thing nobody tells you is that you don't get a warning. There's no year where somebody tells you the deferring is over now. You just look up." I said something defensive. I said I had a kid and a mortgage, and this was what it took. And he stopped at the end of the hallway and said, "I know. I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you what it looks like from the other end, because nobody was standing here to tell me." Then he did the 4th lap and never mentioned it again, and I drove home that night doing math I hadn't done in years. He went into the hospital in July. Pneumonia, on top of a heart that had been running at reduced capacity for 4 years. 9 days at the Cleveland Clinic, 3 of them touch and go. Peter came, flew in the first night, and I want to give the man credit. He stayed 4 days, and he was there, and he handled the medical decision-making with genuine competence. And I watched them together in that room for 4 days, and it was one of the saddest things I have ever witnessed, and I've worked in hospitals for 15 years. They talked about the ejection fraction. They talked about the antibiotics, and the discharge planning, and whether the house needed a stair lift, and Peter took notes on his phone, and Edward answered his questions accurately. 2 men who loved each other, discussing logistics, for 4 days, because it was the only shared language they had ever built. On the 3rd day, Peter came out to the hallway where I was charting, and asked me, straight, "Is he going to be okay?" And I gave him the honest nursing answer, which is that this admission he probably would be, and that the trajectory over the next 2 years was not good. Peter stood there, 53 years old, in a hallway at the clinic, and he said, "I don't know what to say to him. I've never known." I said, and I had no business saying it, and I'd do it again. "Have you told him that?" He looked at me like I'd suggested he set the building on fire. He flew back to Chicago on the 5th day. Edward came home on the 10th. Something had changed. Not the heart. The heart was about where it had been. What changed was that Edward Halloran had spent 9 days in a bed being talked about in the 3rd person by people half his age, and he came home smaller. I don't mean physically, though that too. I mean he'd let go of something. There's a moment in this work when a person stops fighting for the future and starts sorting the past, and you can feel it happen in a room. He started giving things away that August. Not dramatically. He'd hand me something. A watch, which I refused. Books. A painting for Aubrey that I did take. A small one of a harbor, and which is hanging in my hallway right now. And he started telling me the whole story instead of pieces. August 2019, in that kitchen, over about 6 weeks, Edward Halloran told me about his life in a way I don't think he'd told anyone, including Corinne, and probably especially Corinne. He told me about his father, who'd worked for the railroad and died at 54, owing money to people who came to the house. He told me about being 19 and deciding, he used that word, deciding, like a business decision, that he was going to be a man nobody ever came to the house about. He told me about the years between 1968 and 1988 in a level of detail that made it clear he'd been over them many times alone. Deals, buildings, a partner named Cy Rothstein who died in 1991, and who was, Edward said, the last person who ever told me I was wrong about anything. What struck me, listening to those 6 weeks of story, is that there was no villain anywhere in it. No betrayal, no scandal, nothing you could point to and say there, that's where it went wrong. It was just a man making sensible decisions in sequence for 60 years, each one defensible, and arriving somewhere he never intended to be. And in the middle of all of it, one Tuesday morning in September, he said the thing. It was 7:15 in the morning. I'd gotten there early because he'd had a bad night. He was at the kitchen table in the cardigan. I was making eggs, and he said, apropos of nothing that had come before it, I want to tell you what I actually regret. Because I've thought about it a great deal and everybody assumes it's the obvious thing, and it isn't. I turned the burner down. He said, everyone thinks I regret working too much. That's the story. The old man in the big house who worked too hard and lost his family. It's a very tidy story. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, which he did when he was choosing words. I don't regret the work. I was good at it. It built the life, it educated my children, it paid for Corinne's mother's care for 9 years. I'd do the work again. Then he said, what I regret is that I never let anyone see me struggle. Not once. Not my wife, not my children, not Cy. 40 years, and I made sure that every single person who loved me only ever saw the finished thing. He looked up. You cannot be close to a finished thing, Denise. There's nowhere to stand. I made myself a wall, and then I spent the last 10 years of my life wondering why nobody could reach me. I did not say anything. I remember the eggs burning and not caring. He said, "My son doesn't know how to talk to me because I never gave him anything to talk to. He's got a perfect record of a man who never had a bad day. Never lost a deal he'll admit to. Never once said, 'I don't know how to do this.' What is he supposed to do with that? Where's the door?" And then he said the sentence I have repeated to more people than anything I've ever heard in my life. I thought I was protecting them. I was just making myself unreachable and calling it strength. He drank his coffee. He said, "That's it. That's the whole regret. It isn't the hours." I want to tell you what that did to me, standing at that stove at 35 with a spatula in my hand. Because I had spent 6 years since my divorce being extremely competent in front of my daughter, never letting her see me cry about money, never telling her when a shift broke me, answering how was work with fine honey for 6 straight years. I'd been so proud of that. I thought it was the whole job. And an 81-year-old man in a 14-room house had just told me it was the exact mechanism by which you become someone your children can't reach. I asked him, and my voice was not steady, which he pretended not to notice, whether he thought it was fixable. At 81. He took a long time with that one. He said, "I think the record's the record. 40 years of a man who never needed anything. You don't undo that with a phone call." Then he turned the cup another quarter turn and said, "But I think if I'd figured it out at 55, that would have been a different conversation. Or 40, or your age." He looked at me directly then, which he almost never did. "That's why I'm telling you, and not somebody else." I finished the eggs. I gave him his eggs, and then I went out to my car on my lunch and sat there for 30 minutes without turning the engine on. I'm going to say something to whoever's listening, and then I'll finish the story. There's a version of this that turns into a lecture about work-life balance, and I'm not qualified to give it, and I don't believe it. I work a lot. I have to. Most people watching this have to. When somebody tells you to just work less, check whether they've ever had a month where the car repair and the school fee land in the same week. What Edward said isn't about hours. That's why it's stuck. You can work 60 hours a week and still let your kids see you struggle. You can be exhausted and still say, "I don't know how to do this," out loud at your own kitchen table. Those two things are not related, and I had spent 6 years assuming they were, using how hard I worked as the reason I had to be flawless in front of my daughter. The hours were real. The wall was a choice. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because what I did next didn't work, at least not at first. And that's the part I most want to get right. I went home that night and decided I was going to be open now, capital O, and I sat Aubrey down. She was 11, and I told her about the money, all of it. The overtime, the credit card, the number in the account. That was a mistake. She didn't need my balance sheet. She was 11. What I did that night wasn't letting her see me struggle. It was handing an 11-year-old a load she had no ability to set down, and she was anxious for 2 weeks and asked me 3 separate times if we were going to lose the apartment. I felt sick about it. And I called the one person I knew who'd understand, which was a nurse I'd worked with named Roz Pelletier, 22 years in peds, and she said the thing that made it click. She said, "There's a difference between letting your kid see you struggle and asking your kid to carry it. You don't tell her the number. You tell her you're tired. You let her see you not have the answer to something small. That's the door." So I did the smaller version, and the smaller version worked. Over that fall, I started saying true things at a size an 11-year-old could hold. "I'm worn out today. I'm not going to be much fun. It's not you. I don't know how to fix this. I have to think about it." Once, in November, after a shift where I lost a patient I'd had for 2 years, I sat on the couch and cried in front of her, instead of doing it in the car in the lot, which is where I'd done it for 15 years. She sat next to me. She didn't say anything. She just put her head on my arm. And afterward, over about 6 months, she started telling me things. Not because I asked. Because a kid tells you things when they've concluded you're a person and not a service. That's the whole mechanism. I'd had it backwards my entire life. I want to name the thing that made it hard, because just be more open is useless advice and I resent hearing it. What made it hard is that being the competent one was the only thing I was sure I was good at. After the divorce, that was my whole identity. Denise handles it. Denise doesn't fall apart. Every time I said a true tired thing out loud in front of my daughter, some part of me was certain I was withdrawing from an account I couldn't afford to touch. It felt like losing status in my own house. It took maybe a year before I stopped feeling that. And I only got through the year because an 81-year-old man had told me exactly what the alternative looks like at the end. Edward died in February 2020 at 82. It was not dramatic. Congestive heart failure, an admission that went badly, 6 days. I was not on duty when he went. That happens more often than families expect, and it still stings. Peter and Catherine both came. They were both there at the end, which matters, and I've thought about that. There was a service at a church in Cleveland Heights, maybe 40 people. A man that wealthy, 40 people, most of them from the industry, and most of them over 70. Catherine gave the eulogy. And it was a good one, and it was careful, and I could hear her working around the shape of what she couldn't say. She talked about how hard he worked, about integrity. Several people used that word, and every time somebody said it, I thought about what that word had cost that family, about the business. Peter didn't speak. He sat in the front row with his hands on his knees, in a good suit, and afterward he stood by the door and shook 40 hands and thanked every person for coming, competently, the way his father would have. Afterward, at the house, the dining room finally in use, the sheet off the table, 14 rooms open for the first time in a decade, Catherine found me by the kitchen. She said, "He talked to you." And I said yes. And I told her, because he was dead, and I decided he'd have wanted it, and I'll live with that decision. I told her what he'd said that Tuesday morning about the wall. I watched her face do something complicated. She said, "He knew that? He knew that?" I said he did. At the end, he did. And she said, "And this is the thing I want you to hear, because it's the actual cost." Then why didn't he say it to me? I was here in January. I was standing right there. I didn't have an answer. I've had 6 years to think about it, and here's the closest I've got. He told me because I was safe. Because I wasn't going to be hurt by what he said, and I didn't need anything from him. A nurse is the perfect audience for a confession. Present, temporary, no stake in the outcome. Telling Catherine would have required him to risk her response, to hand a real thing to someone who could be devastated by it. That's the exact skill he'd spent 60 years not building. So he practiced on me, and ran out of time before the performance. That's the part that keeps me up. He got all the way to the inside and still couldn't cross the last 3 feet of his own kitchen. Because here's what I've learned since working the specialty I work now. Understanding the problem is maybe 20% of it. People arrive at the insight all the time, usually somewhere around the second hospital admission. What almost nobody has is the practice. Saying a vulnerable thing to someone who can be hurt by it is a physical skill, like a golf swing, and if you haven't done it in 40 years, your body will simply not perform it when it counts. Catherine and I stayed in touch for a while after. Christmas cards. She told me in 2022 that she and Peter had started actually talking, for the first time in their adult lives, and that it had taken their father dying for the two of them to say anything real to each other. She said, "We're doing the thing he couldn't." I don't know if that's a tribute or the saddest possible outcome. I said I thought it could be both. Here's what I actually did with it. Because insight without a change Tuesday is just a good story you tell at parties. I left private duty in 2021 and went back to a hospital system, in palliative care. Less money, about $11,000 a year less, which is not nothing when you're a single mother, but it's the work I'm supposed to be doing, and I know that now in a way I didn't at 35. Palliative care is not hospice, though people confuse them. It's the specialty for people with serious illness who may have years left. And a large part of my week is sitting in rooms having conversations that families have been avoiding for decades. And I use Edward. Constantly. Not his name, I've never used his name until now, and I've thought hard about whether to. But I sit down with a 68-year-old man with COVID whose son is in the hallway, and I say, "Your kids don't need you to be strong right now. They need you to be reachable, and those aren't the same thing." Half of them look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language, because I am. But some of them don't. I've watched maybe 15 or 20 families have a conversation in a hospital room that they'd been not having since the Nixon administration. That's the whole job. That's what I'm for. And I've watched a lot more not have it. That's the honest number. Most of the time I say the thing, and the room stays exactly as it was, and the son goes back out to the hallway, and everybody is polite. I've had to make my peace with a job where the win rate is maybe 1 in 4, and where you never find out what happened after discharge. Aubrey's 19 now. She's at Kent State, nursing, which I had complicated feelings about and have made my peace with. We're close. And I don't say that the way parents say it when they mean their kid still lives at home. I mean she calls me and tells me things she doesn't have to tell me. Last spring she called me at 11 at night about a boy, and about halfway through she stopped and said, "Is this okay? Are you working tomorrow?" And I said I was, and that it was fine, and I was tired but I wanted to hear it. Tired and wanting to hear it. Both, out loud, in the same sentence. That's the thing I could not have said at 34. At 34 I'd have said, no, I'm fine, and been slightly less present for the rest of the call, and she'd have registered it without knowing she had. And after enough of those, she'd have stopped calling at 11, not angry, just quietly concluding that her mother was busy, which is what kids conclude, and they're rarely wrong about it. I want to be honest about the limits though. I did not become a wide-open person. I'm still a woman who processes things alone in a car. My mother and I still can't talk about anything that matters, and she's 74, and I've made about 4 attempts and I don't know if there's a 5th in me. Catherine's line, "There's a limit to how long a person can beg," turns out to apply in both directions, and the money is worse than it was. I gave up $11,000 a year to do work that means something, and I've had 2 Decembers since where I genuinely did not know how the month was going to close. I don't have a tidy answer for that. Both things are just true, and I've stopped needing the ledger to come out clean before I'll call the decision a good one. The house sold in late 2020. I looked it up once. Some couple in their 40s, tech money, and I hope to God they use all 14 rooms. I still have the painting, small harbor scene, gray water. It's in my hallway and I walk past it maybe 15 times a day, and probably actually see it twice a month. I want to leave you with the thing I've turned over the most. Edward Halloran was not a bad man. He was not neglectful in any way you could point at. He worked, he provided, he was faithful, he showed up to the wedding. If you'd made a list of what a man was supposed to do in 1965 and checked it against his life, he'd have scored nearly perfect. He just never let anybody see the underside, and that one thing, that single, invisible, entirely well-intentioned decision, repeated daily for 60 years, is why 14 rooms had the shades drawn. He wasn't alone because he was cruel. He was alone because he was impressive, on purpose, without a break, for his whole life. I think about how much of what we call strength is actually just a very long-running refusal to be known, and I think about the fact that nobody around him ever called it that. They called it dignity. They called it his generation. If you're a person who's proud of not burdening anybody, and I was so proud of that, I'd ask you to sit with the possibility that the people who love you are not experiencing it as a gift. They may be experiencing it as a locked door with a very polite sign on it. You don't have to hand anyone your whole balance sheet. Aubrey taught me that the hard way. But somewhere this week, with someone who's earned it, you could say the small true thing. I'm tired. I don't know how to fix this. That one hurt. It's 3 feet across a kitchen. Edward Halloran couldn't cross it in 60 years, and he was a much more capable man than I am. If this one meant something to you, stay with us. Follow the channel, and if there are 5 people in your life who need to hear it, send it to them today. You already know who they are. Leave a comment and tell me honestly what you've been protecting people from and how long you've been doing it. And if there's a story from your own life you think belongs here, tell me that one too. I'm listening for the next one.